Everyone, and welcome to our last speaker presenter of the series. Of course, not least, but it's our last one on this April 14th. Today, we have Dr. Terrell Morton at Dr. T.R. Morton. He's an assistant professor of identity and justice in STEM education at the University of Missouri, Columbia. He's an alumnus of North Carolina A&T State University with a BS in chemistry, and then the University of Miami with his master's in neuroscience, and then at UNC Chapel Hill with his PhD in education, learning sciences, and psychological studies. Very diverse, by the way, Dr. Morgan. I love to see people who enjoy the neurosciences when we have speeches. He identifies as a scholar activist, and his work strives to transform the positioning and understanding of Blackness in mainstream education, specifically STEM, seeking justice and joy for Black women, Black students, and other minoritized individuals given the social, cultural, political, historical positioning of their identities. He's an accomplished immersion scholar, having published in an array of academic journals, obtaining a $5.43 million in external grant funding, and given several global and national talks. And I love this last part because through his every endeavor, he strives to walk it like he talks it. So, with that being said, I guess go ahead and talk it like you walk it, sir.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. And thank you all for the invitation to be able to speak with you all this afternoon. I'm grateful that you all were interested in my ideas and my research and have decided to not only invite me virtually to your space, but to show up on this Thursday. And so I will be kind of presenting to you all sort of like my overarching research agenda and how all of my different projects are sort of interwoven within that perspective. And in doing so, we'll invite questions and comments regarding either some of the very specific research projects that I share or questions related to the overall agenda, my perspectives, and my approach. And I had shared just a little earlier, I tend to be a storyteller in terms of how I recount my experiences. And so there might be aspects to the story that get revealed a little later. So depending on the types of questions and comments that you have, if there's something that emerges during the presentation that you would really like to know more of, I invite you to include that in the chat box. And I will try to be as attentive as I can to that. But then, of course, at the end, when the Q&A is open, invite all forms of providing responses, coming off mute or Q&A or chat. So that being said, and having shared just the formal background, go ahead and share my slides. So again, greetings everyone. I'm excited to speak to you all today on this topic, critical examinations of Blackness in STEM education. And so before I get started, I am going to pose a question to the audience, and we'll ask you all to respond either via chat or through coming off mute. And the question that I want to ask you is, what do you see? I'm going to put some images up on the screen, and I invite you to respond to those images. So this is my very first image. What do you see in this particular image?
Angelina Jolie.
Angelina Jolie. You're seeing presenter mode. Oh wait, did I show the wrong one? I appreciate that. Now what do you see? Power, women. Angelina Jolie, other thoughts? Darkness and lightness. Maleficent. Whimsy. Yes. So all very good recollections. For those of you who know this particular character as Maleficent, what do you know about her backstory? As the Disney animated version of Sleeping Beauty teaches us about Maleficent. In the animated version, we learned that Maleficent is positioned as the evil villain who has come in to curse poor innocent Sleeping Beauty into eternal slumber until Prince Charming can arrive and come and wake Sleeping Beauty from her rest. And so as children, or as people watching this story, we're taught to fear Maleficent. We're taught to hate Maleficent. We're taught that Maleficent embodies this concept of evil because of the fact that she's coming and cursing someone who we are taught to see as pure and as innocent and as unaffected. But in this live action remake, starring Angelina Jolie, who is the actor that we see here in this poster, we're given a different story of Maleficent. And so, spoiler alert for those who have not seen the first show, I think there's 2, possibly 3 now. We actually learned that Maleficent was a fairy living in fairy world among fairy people, when this outcast from human world was now introduced into fairy world, was being raised by the fairies and supported by the fairies and loved by the fairies and even loved by Maleficent. And as this human outcast, Stephen, I believe was his name, attempted to rejoin human world and gain power in human world, his first act to demonstrate strength was to go and to colonize fairy world, because the humans had feared fairy world. And so Maleficent, in order to protect her lands and her people, now take on this persona as a way to demonstrate her power and her desire to stand in the gap between human world attempting to colonize fairy world and her own people. We then get into the storyline where we learn about Maleficent cursing Sleeping Beauty as retaliation to King Stephen, mostly because of the betrayal that he did for her and her people. But we also then find out that Maleficent is the one who breaks the curse from Sleeping Beauty and not King Stephen, because of the love that she ultimately has for Sleeping Beauty as she tries to protect her during her rearing process. And so this alternative version of Maleficent and Sleeping Beauty that we see in the live action story teaches us that Maleficent's character, Maleficent's persona, Maleficent's being is different from what one would have expected based solely off of seeing her. That there was this complex backstory that was leading to the decisions that was causing her to engage in this process. And so you're probably asking me why I'm spending so much time unpacking this Disney story and talking about the juxtaposition between the animated and the live action version. But it goes back to this question of what do you see? And the extent to which, when we're engaging individuals who are not like us, our lenses are shaping what we perceive to be transpiring. And not just what we perceive to be transpiring overall, but how we then see particularly Black students within STEM spaces, and how we're interpreting what the embodied identities and behaviors are that are visible to us, and the extent to which we assume these individuals are disinterested, not capable, unable to be successful, or we begin to understand that backstory that they're actually attempting to navigate and negotiate while they're within their learning spaces. And so the takeaway lesson from that introductory sort of conversation was this idea that our perceptions or our perspectives or even our positioning shapes the various knowledge, experiences, beliefs, characteristics, and understandings that we maintain. And it is this reciprocal fashion of thinking about how we are being socialized to interpret, to understand, to see, and to believe different facets or components of what's transpiring in our backgrounds. And this is just as much social cultural as it is scientific, as we think about it from a neuroscience perspective, and this idea of long-term and short-term memory, and the different neural hooks that our brain creates as a way to retrieve information in an expedited amount of time so that we can then process and determine whether or not what we're interacting with is something that we must fight, something that we must flight or run from, or something that we perceive to be safe and embrace and endure. And so in essence, both socially, culturally, and scientifically, our perceptions are ultimately reflections of ourselves, our upbringings, our ways of understanding the world, which prompts us to ask the question then, who am I? How do I situate myself within this larger world? How do I come around to ascribe to different beliefs and values and norms around identity and the ways in which I operate and exist within this world to then determine what counts as reality, what counts as truth, what counts as knowledge, what counts as moral or ethical behavior, or what counts as this essence of being. And so in the introduction, you heard a little bit about who I am in terms of my educational pedigree and the different experiences that I've traversed over time. But what I think is more important outside of my educational pedigree are those meaningful moments, those people, those socializing agents and influences that have led me to make specific commitments and decisions to the work that I'm doing. And so I think about my identities as a scientist, my identities as a social scientist and as a speaker. I think about the family connections that I have being raised by my grandparents and mother in a multi-generational household, and my grandparents being educators and teachers and pastors and civil rights activists and very community-oriented, service-based people, and how their perspectives then led to my own beliefs and values about how I show up in this space and the forms of activism that I take, and then the ways in which that activism then shows up both scholastically, both interactions across people, as well as through the different institutions that I create or support or engage as I'm thinking about investing in both present and next generations of scholars and learners. And so my positionality is complex. It's comprising the identities that I maintain, but those identities are shaping privileges that I've been able to ascertain because of my experiences, because of the places that I've traversed. And those privileges are then giving me different exposures and awarenesses that I'm using in concert with my privileges and my identities to then think about the commitments that I want to make, those promises that I'm making to myself, as well as to other people about how I want to show up in the world. And what's even more important from those promises is then those actions. What I actually do on a day-to-day basis to demonstrate the commitments, to demonstrate those verbal promises, showing, in fact, that I am walking it like I talk it when it comes to how I'm understanding the world. And so all of this is comprising my positionality and how I'm entering into this space when I think about the research that I'm doing, when I think about my teaching, when I think about my service, when I think about my community engagement, and even my activism. And as a scholar, these perspectives are very much situated within these two sort of overarching theoretical frameworks. Phenomenological variant ecological systems theory, which is on the left side of the screen or right, just depending which one you're looking at. And then critical race theory, which is on that opposite side. Phenomenological variant ecological systems theory, coming out of the child development research, talks about the intimate connection and relationship between the essence of being, phenomenology, how one perceives and understands and interprets who they are, given the multiple senses that they're leveraging to interact with the world, how that then influences their different decision-making patterns, and what that then means in terms of different outcomes and potential reinforced stereotypes or biases about people, juxtaposed to this ecological systems, borrowing from Bronfenbrenner's bioecological systems theory, where we think about that nested structure of environments and how norms and values and beliefs and perspectives and understandings of success and reality are infiltrating across our different environments, be it macro society, exo, one layer down, our various communities, meso, our parents' job or direct interactions, or micro, that actual immediate day-to-day learning environment that we exist within, and how this changes over time. I think about this perspective through a critical race theory bounding, where I'm very intentional to name racism as real, as permanent, and as structural, given the inception of the United States that was being based off of the forced enslavement of African individuals and the attempted extermination of the indigenous people that were inhabiting these lands. And how this belief about people, their possibilities or their capabilities, have situated all of our concepts of normality across all social institutions within the United States. And so recognizing sort of this controversial debate around critical race theory that's transpiring in the nation, and how people are trying to tease out what is critical race theory or what isn't, I often draw on this metaphor in my presentations or in my teachings to try to help people understand on a more pragmatic level what critical race theory is versus what it is not. And so the metaphor goes like this. If you're walking along a lake and you happen to see one fish belly side up and all of the other fish are swimming happily, the question that most people tend to ask is, what's wrong with the fish? Why is this individual fish operating differently than the rest of the fish that are swimming in this body of water? But if you're happening to walk along that same lake and you see hundreds of thousands of fish belly side up, most people then ask the question, what's wrong with the lake? What is wrong with this ecosystem that is causing this space in which all of these fish are demonstrating this particular behavior or response? Critical race theory gives us that power to say the same thing about racism. And rather than thinking about racism as these individual acts of hate and these individual intended desires to perpetuate oppression against people, we can think about it as this structure. How over time we've had these norms, these policies, these beliefs, these practices that have continued to reinstantiate the marginalization and oppression of people based off of presumed differences, given what we can visibly see about someone's race. And so it is shifting the conversations about race and racism from individual acts of hate to systems and structures that are embedded in our everyday experiences. And is not just giving us that power to ask conversations about race and racism, but is giving us that power to ask the same conversations about diversity and inclusion. And rather than thinking about individuals as problematic and why it is that there's so few Black people or brown people or women or LGBTQ people or people from different religious backgrounds or different neurological and physical abilities, we can ask questions about our policies and practices that have created the space in which we see such distinct differences in physical, numerical representation, as well as ideological representation in our spaces and in our concepts of normality. And so this model, this critical race theory and this PVEST model, thus affords us the opportunity to think deep, to be able to go from those very reactionary events that we can see on a day-to-day basis, those symptoms that we are seeing, to think about those root causes, those mental models, those logics, those schemas that are organizing how people are thinking about each other, thinking about community, thinking about reality, thinking about knowledge, thinking about being, and creating then structures based off of those mental models, and allowing those structures to then become its own sort of third space that's controlling how we're interacting and engaging each other. And so I use these perspectives to think intentionally about Black students in STEM post-secondary education, where the data that I'm showing you here presents two juxtapositions. One on the left, again, coming from our most recent science and engineering indicators, talks about science and engineering degree completion from four-year colleges and universities over time, disaggregated by race. And we can see in this particular figure different historical trends about graduation rates. But what's really interesting about this figure, recognizing that data from a national standpoint has somewhat of a lag in terms of its interpretations, juxtaposed to data collected around interest in majoring in STEM, our greatest measure for determining how many people are enrolled in STEM majors, we see that Black students are entering into our spaces, expressing intentions to major in STEM, roughly around 23%, but yet historically, for the past 17 or more years, are consistently graduating at a rate where only about 9% of those degrees are being awarded. And this 9% of degrees being awarded is underrepresentation if we think about nationally how Black people represent around 13.5 to 14% of the population. And if we were trying to be equitable based off of national representation, we would want to see that same degree awardance to Black individuals. But what's even more interesting as we're thinking intentionally about this data is this historical trend component, and is recognizing that there's been this uptake in STEM and STEM education, particularly within the United States, since the 1960s, when the USSR Sputnik was launched to orbit the moon, and our desire as a country to be globally competitive in that space race. And so we can then trace from the 1960s to present day, all of these national policies and initiatives and programmatic endeavors that have been focused on increasing STEM education, increasing STEM access, increasing STEM opportunities, while thinking about how we can not only get more people, but get more people through diversifying this experience. And so when you dive into the research literature that talks about diversity within STEM education, you see research that talks about targeted opportunities. There's these bridge programs, there's these undergraduate research experiences, there's all of these initiatives that are focusing on broadening participation within STEM education. You see research that talks about community building and the importance of having these identity-focused clubs and organizations, having these multi-level mentoring programs and practices. You see research that talks about skill development, how these students can develop content knowledge, procedural knowledge as it relates to their specific discipline, so that they can then build up their academic and professional skills in order to function at the workplace space. And you even see research that talks about the financial constraints and what scholarships and paid experiences mean in terms of diversifying this STEM experience to get more people to interact and engage within this space. And so some examples programmatically or practically that we've seen historically and even in present day are here provided in this list. Be it those bridge programs, be it those scholarship opportunities, be it those different affinity groups. But despite the fact that these things are present, we're still only graduating at about 9%. And so I'm asking these questions about why are these targeted approaches not advancing the mantle in ways that are increasing degree completion and even matriculation? And so it's leveraging that critical race theory and that PVEST frame to dive deeper into the scholarship and think critically about what's transpiring. And I've landed on, continuing in my Disney metaphoric phase, that our approaches to STEM inclusion, diversity, and equity are very much taking the Cinderella format to how we're engaging this work. And it's this idea that our programs are coming in as fairy godmothers, and they're taking Cinderellas, our poor, despot, podunk, underrepresented, underserved, at-risk individuals, and they're sprinkling their magic on these individuals to help them transform these people into this individual that can then be whisked away and entering into our STEM communities and be able to operate in this society as a very recognized, competent individual who's able to act in STEM. And this fairy godmother Cinderella mindset to how we're approaching diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM is rooted based off of our perspectives of justice and social justice orientations, more largely, but also particularly within education. And so what we see here now in this particular slide, in this middle image, is a picture coming from the iconic movie Hidden Figures. And Hidden Figures is the story of Katherine Johnson, Mary Jackson, and Dorothy Vaughan, three phenomenal Black women who were instrumental in ensuring the NASA space launch that could support John Glenn's orbit around the Earth. And what's different in the written story of Hidden Figures compared to the video movie version of Hidden Figures is the Kevin Costner character. In the movie, we see Kevin Costner as being this translator, this person who's operating in this space to come in and save and protect and serve these three Black women as they're trying to navigate this racially engendered hostile space of NASA during the 1960s. And this character did not actually exist in reality. Hollywood felt that in order for this story to truly be embraced by a majority audience, that there would have to be some sort of white savioristic character in place to help mitigate any emotional responses or rage-based responses that could come with that white guilt associated with reckoning with how we're understanding our nation's very controversial history with racism and race. And this idea of having this savioristic mentality comes from our perspectives of social justice, where we're thinking about what it actually represents when it comes to a justice format. And so this particular image is one that we've seen, or at least a version of something that we've seen that's talked about the differences in experiences among people when it comes to equality and equity and even justice. And based off of this demographic, what one could surmise is this idea that justice equates fairness. Borrowing from this theory of justice, where justice ensures the right to equal access towards a basic liberty in the similar vein as others, whereas that right to fair treatment in a manner that is reasonably expected. And so if we connect this idea to the picture, is recognizing that that gate served as a barrier for these three individuals to watch the baseball game. And so justice as fairness would mean that we could remove this barrier so that all individuals could participate in this space. This idea of justice or fairness is rooted in a very liberalistic perspective where we equate rational behaviors to individual actions and interactions. And so I'm thinking about those three individual people and what they need as an individual. And so I'm going to remove this barrier because that seems to be rational based off of what I would assume to be their collective desires, goals, and needs. And so then we have this concept then that justice becomes this more idealistic goal where we're really thinking about this equal distribution of social values in our third-spaced constructed society. The challenge, though, with this theory of justice is who are these actors and what are their beliefs that are operating within this society? And then to what extent are these actors and their beliefs determining what is seen or unseen, just or unjust, and the ways in which we respond to that particular scenario? Is it in fact just for us to remove the gate so that these three individuals can watch the baseball game? Or was it more just for us to find ways to have these three individuals present within the baseball game, sitting within the stadium, allowing them to meaningfully interact with the community in ways that everyone else was? Was it just for us to assume that it was even a baseball game that they desired to watch? And maybe they just desired to see their friends or their family members who were present. And so now we're removing this barrier and we're not even taking into account their own perspectives in this sort of rational society that we've constructed. So given these critiques of justice, thinking then about this data of Black students and these traditional approaches that we've embraced in our DEI endeavors, my research has strived to address sort of these overarching questions or ideas. How do Black students navigate post-secondary STEM spaces, name themselves within these contexts? What is important for them to say and to see and to do and to hear and to understand as they're entering in these STEM spaces? And then in thinking about their namings, how then are they conceptualizing what their identity means within this community that we've constructed? What are those signs and those symbols and those cues that they're paying attention to in the learning environment? And how cognitively are they shaping then their decisions that are impacting their behaviors, what we can physically see on a day-to-day basis? And then based off of then understanding what they name and what they desire and how they're perceiving this learning space, what can we do as power brokers in this space to radically transform our culture and our learning environments, rather than focusing on radically transforming the individuals as fairy godmothers and that Cinderella fairy tale? And so I draw on various critical theoretical perspectives in my approach to post-secondary STEM education, thinking about anti-Blackness, thinking about Afrofuturism, Black feminisms, critical race theory, critical race feminism, community cultural wealth, to wrestle with this understanding of naming, how identities are conceptualizing, and then leveraging that information to create these radically transformative spaces. And so the first study that I will then get into talks about this concept of asking Black women, how do they name themselves in STEM spaces? Where in their responses, they give us this powerful poem that says, I am.
I am African American, Muslim, Nigerian, Christian, Black. But first, I am a woman. I'm a female, a cis woman. I'm African American. African American slash Black. A Black American. A young Black woman. Society doesn't see Black females as scientists. Black females are sassy, loud, intimidating, not intelligent, or sleep around. Black females have bad attitudes, being entertainers or baby mamas.
Growing up, I've had social safety nets, my family, church family, and dance school. I didn't feel any negativity. The community, it's mostly Black people. The community supported me a lot. I wanted to attend an HBCU. Black people in America are more open to Islam.
I've been struggling my whole life, but I was determined. I'm going to learn this thing. Never mind. I tried. I'm still learning. I don't think God would bring me this far for me not to be doing it in the future. If I am feeling bad, I always pray. Whenever I don't know what to do, I just try and pray. Just praying helps. I turn to the Bible and I go to church. My faith is really important to me. I rely on my faith. I enjoy serving in my campus ministry church.
I'm self-sufficient, getting stuff done on my own. I'm responsible for the things I do and the outcome. I don't need someone pushing me. I can do that myself. I'm strong. I can keep going, wanting to pursue my dream to help undeserved women. I want to be a part of helping people. I want to help Black youth. I'm really interested in racial disparity issues.
I'm a sister, a daughter. I'm a human being, so I have multiple parts. I am still the person that I am. I'll still be distinguished. I have two identifiers, Black and female. My Blackness is huge. My being a woman is huge. African American woman, it's just a different vibe.
So shout out to my participants for giving us very powerful stories regarding how they name themselves within these STEM spaces. And I also want to shout out the Black women members of my family who supported me and thinking through this idea of I am and being able to present this in a way that elevates their voices rather than having me tell their stories. And if we're teasing out this data, we can see this juxtaposition between what society is attempting to regulate for Black women in terms of how they should operate versus what they are naming for themselves, their self-determined beliefs, values, and goals, and how they're negotiating between what society says and what they want to then enact their own values, beliefs, and perspectives within this space. And so that led me then to ask critical questions about that negotiation process and how are then Black students making sense of themselves while they're entering into our STEM spaces. And so that next study sort of led me to think about this idea of a racialized metacognition, where their identities are serving then as those lenses to then determine and even organize their mental schemas as they're wanting to decide, where do I sit within the classroom? Who do I embrace as a peer as I'm thinking about working groups? How do I respond to what the professors are telling me when it comes to my interactions and my engagements within my learning environment? And their decisions are based off of how they are interpreting Blackness from these thin or thick conceptions. Thin being very surface level. I see you, you look like me, I'm assuming we have a lived story, and so now we're going to come together and embrace ourselves. Whereas a more thick conception of Blackness could think about that socio-political consciousness that people have, and the different organizations or clubs that people join, given this shared value system or this shared belief. And this idea that their Blackness is regulating how they're understanding is also in conversation with different salient identities, recognizing the multiplicative nature of identity and how people are very complex beings and aren't just thinking through one dimension of their identity, but these dimensions of identity may be more or less salient as they're navigating different spaces. Which shares to me then that it's this idea that there is this perspective where we see, again, society attempting to control, attempting to regulate, attempting to keep out, Black students, Black women having their own desires and seeing these different breadcrumbs that we may be dropping regarding our interest, getting into these STEM spaces, facing challenges, and then as a result, drawing on some of their own funds of knowledge, foundational skills, or navigational capital to then get over that hump, to create their own bridges as they're looking to go through to that next space. And so how I then organize it overall is recognizing how their identities do serve as these vulnerability-seeking factors that then inform or influence the stress engagements that they experience on a day-to-day basis. And as they're experiencing that stress, they're having to generate these reactive coping mechanisms, where their reactive coping mechanisms can be their desires to assimilate into these cultural spaces that we've created, or to flat out reject these spaces. And if they're continuing to demonstrate those same behaviors in responses to those same stresses, then what they're doing is now developing for themselves an emergent identity, or other people are projecting onto them a particular identity that they had to negotiate and respond to. These identities are impacting then their overall outcomes, which then, going back to the data full circle at the beginning of our story, is situating the different stereotypes or biases or assumptions that we're making about people from these very collective groups. And so if we see this cycle of Black students being pushed out and now our graduation rates are lower, we're going to make these assumptions about that next cycle of Black individuals coming in and what they're capable of doing, what they could do, what they can't do, what resources they need and what resources they don't need. And how all of this is transpiring within this deeply rooted, deeply nested culture. And our practices are being informed then by that next layer of beliefs and outcomes and decisions. And what's really interesting to think about is that this cycle is happening for our students, but it's also happening for our faculty, it's happening for our professional staff, and it's happening for our administrators and all of the different actors that are transpiring within this ecosystem, where there's these now relationships that are happening that can either be supportive, facilitating success, or potentially combative. And we're seeing tension that's happening as these different figured worlds are coming into contact with one another, where an individual's reactive coping to the stressors can create stress for someone else and vice versa. Again, still very much being nested in sort of these third-spaced beliefs, values, perspectives, and day-to-day practices. And so as my work continues in exploring and thinking deeply about these systems and these structures and how Black students are navigating these spaces and the perspectives by which we're attempting to tell those stories, is getting to this component where we can begin to identify and then target those key structures and stressors and begin to manipulate those variables in ways that transform the learning environments, that transform those cultural ideologies, rather than focusing on transforming the individuals and then examining what that transformation process now means for our Black students as they're now navigating our STEM spaces and having to think through their identities and have these cultures, consciousnesses, managing their motivation, managing their responses, and so on and so forth. And so at this particular presentation, you might be like, all right, you have shared a whole lot of information. You done given me metaphors, you got poems, you got music, you're talking about things that's very controversial in the general public. Like, what am I supposed to do with all of this information? Like, how am I supposed to digest it? Am I supposed to care? What should I care about? Well, it's this idea of thinking about how we can nuance our conceptions of Blackness within our research, and how we can begin to recognize that people's ontological and epistemological standpoints are very complex. And what we see as this embodied identity is a social, cultural, political embodiment of somebody's perceptions of their learning perspectives. And so if we can create the research methodologies and the theoretical frameworks and our various methods and tools of analysis and even our outcomes from these multiplicative, multidimensional spaces, then we can de-essentialize how we're treating Blackness and our policies. We can de-essentialize how we're thinking about Black being and Black needs in our everyday practices. It's thinking then about telling Black experiences and stories from these very strengths-based approaches, how we can reject these deficit models and these deficiency narratives about Black being, Black capabilities, and Black possibilities, and instead embracing and building from this assumption and belief that Black is brilliant, Black is bold, Black is beautiful, and Black is strong. If we're constantly trying to compare Black students to white students, Black women to white women, and we always have whiteness as our focal normal point, we're always going to be creating some sort of deficit interpretation of what other people who are not white are doing, because our benchmark has been situated around a particular group. But if we can disrupt this individualistic benchmark and instead see benchmarks from each community and normalize within communities rather than across communities, then we can begin to focus our interventions towards that structural oppression, that system that we're all having to navigate, even if we did not individually choose the roles and the responsibilities that we've been given in this game of life, which means that we can begin to critically imagine or even reimagine the culture of STEM education. And is leveraging these critical frameworks to ask questions about policies, procedures, practices, and culture, to then say, what can we do to prompt change in this ideological space? What can we do to prompt change in this cultural space? What can we do to prompt change in our policies and in our practices and in our procedures so that we have this more inclusive, equitable, just, and joyous space for Black individuals, recognizing that Blackness is not just the trauma that has been inflicted upon us, but it is the love and the laughter and the joy and the essence of being that we have by being able to dwell within community. And so I leave us then with this quote given to us by this powerful scholar activist, Lilla Watson. It's this idea that if you come into this space trying to help somebody, then you're wasting your time. Because one, I don't even know if I need your help. I don't even know if your help is what can actually support me. I don't even know who you are and who your people are. But if you recognize that we're all being manipulated in this larger system, and we're all then can work together to liberate ourselves, then let us be in community and in conversation and not in conflict. Let us exchange resources and funds of knowledge and power in a very reciprocal fashion so that we're all elevating and not just some of us or incrementally elevating. And so I invite you to check out some of my work across the multiple projects that I have going on, different presentations that I have given, and will now open the floor up for questions or comments or responses to the group.
Well, I don't mind starting with a comment if it'll open up the floodgates of information. I really enjoyed that particular part when you mentioned both safety and joy. As a person who's new into this field of practicing equity and social justice, I feel like the narrative is always for our marginalized groups, let's make them feel safe, let's make us feel safe. But to me, safe is such a bar that's so low to the ground that it shouldn't even be discussed. It's a civilized society where we are supposedly working together for this common ground. Safety should be understood. It's that facet of joy, that comfortability that I feel like we don't seem to talk about enough because we're too busy saying, well, there are people feeling unsafe. And it's just, to me, an argument that should even be had. Safety, no, I want to feel the same joy that all groups feel, the same comfortability, whether or not that's walking outside at night or going to the grocery store without being bothered. I want to feel that much more than safety. I should have already had that. So.
And I would agree with you. It's because, again, from a structural level, we have a very unilateral vision. What we see is myopic. And because of the fact that marginalized individuals have had to be in survival mode, it's always this idea of what can be done to ensure survival. Beverly Tatum, a psychologist who started at Spelman, talked about this idea of dominant versus targeted identities and how dominant identities don't necessarily have to think about a targeted experience because it's not within their lived reality. But the targeted group is always mindful of the dominant experience because they have to think about what it takes to survive. And we see that in the stories that people tell when they talk about racial differences. We see that in the stories that people tell when they talk about gender differences and the privileges that a man may have in walking along alone at night across campus versus what women may have to pay attention to in order to ensure their survival. We really need to start to disrupt this conversation, like you said, where we're solely focused on survival to think about what are the structures to ensure joy. We're people. We have a range of emotions. We should be able to have all of our emotions experienced and not just only have to operate through one dimension. Thank you so much. I appreciate the confirmation in the chat. I know sometimes it takes time to process because I do throw a lot of information at people, but I do invite continued conversations even outside of this particular space.
I just have to say thank you so much for coming, and I really appreciate the huge holistic, micro, macro, all of the multidimensional elements that you're able to provide for us to see, all the dynamics, but then also even push us further, I think, and grappling with this, often the inclination to just reach out to help, right? Like we have to dig deeper than to reside within a mindset of I'm here to help, but we are in this together to transform everything to be better for all. So I really appreciate that really big picture and narrow picture all at the same time that you give us.
Thank you so much. You know, sometimes it can be difficult to see both the forest and the trees. And then even in seeing the forest and the trees, do we pay attention to then the ecosystems that are surrounding the trees, where there's moss and where there's flowers and where animals burrow and so on and so forth. And so I really tried to have a space where I can see the tree, the forest, and the ecosystem, and we can think about how things are working in concert. And a lot of it also comes from my own experience as a musician working in a marching band. We know that a marching band, each instrument is playing its own part, but then within each section, you could have multiple parts across those sections. But there's a conductor there to try to bring stuff together. There's that percussion section, that's that underlying rhythm that's helping people stay together. So it's thinking about how we can be in concert and being mindful of all of these parts as we're working on the individual and the collective performance.
I so appreciate all the metaphors you use, Dr. Morton. It's really nice. And I think it's going to be really helpful for our students and everybody on the call to really think about these really complicated issues and really simple metaphors. So I really, really appreciate this talk. This was just terrific. Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for the invitation. And as always, feel free to reach out via Twitter, via email. If anyone is traveling to San Diego in person, I will be there in person. As well, I see some names and faces that I've interacted with before in other professional spaces. So always happy to be in conversation and be in community as we're all kind of thinking about these ideas.
Okay, well, with that, it is 12:59, approaching 1 p.m. So thank you again for coming out. This was a wonderful session. As I prepare for my class tonight on a very similar issue, I'm going to tastefully borrow some of those ideas. Don't worry, I will cite you, but but I will borrow some of those ideas. So thank you for coming out and giving me such an uplifting session today.
Thank you, and you all enjoy the rest of your day and week. Take care.
Bye, everyone.